We think social justice is a good way of confronting the history of the present.
The language of social justice was in some ways present, but also absent in state socialist countries during the post-war era.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast, brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
Welcome to the Transformative Podcast. I am Radka Šustrová, Associate Researcher at the Research Center for the History of Transformations. In today's episode, I speak with two distinguished guests. Martin Conway is a professor of contemporary European history at the University of Oxford. He's the author of major studies of Belgium and most recently Europeans' Democratic Age, Western Europe 1945-1968, published by Princeton University Press in 2020. My second guest is Camilo Erlichman, Associate Professor of History at Maastricht University. He has published widely on occupation regimes and is also co-founder of the Occupation Studies Research Network. Both guests have a long-standing interest in the political and institutional transformation of modern Europe, and together they bring a rich historical lens to the evolving meanings of social justice across the 20th century. You are most welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Our conversation centers on your recently co-edited volume titled Social Justice in the 20th Century Europe, published by Cambridge University Press in 2024. This is the first historical investigation of social justice as a concept and practice across the 20th century. Now, at the time when the social justice is increasingly contested in the public discourse, this volume invites us to reconsider its historical foundation and political uses. We had a chance to preview some of these discussions in Vienna at the recent event co-organized by research project Work Aid Just and the Bruno Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue. Today, we build on that to explore how this volume contributes a fresh research perspective and why social justice remains such a vital yet elusive historical topic. Let's start with the conceptual framing of the project. Social justice is a broad and often contested term with multiple and sometimes conflicting meanings. Did you work with a working definition or framing while developing this volume? Or was the project more an open exploratory field to test and challenge existing understandings?
So the kind of usual approach to social justice, and I think most of the social sciences, would of course be to start with a defined meaning of the term. Very often there's this notion that you first have to kind of say what the concept actually means before you're in a position to talk about it. But of course, the historical approach is to do in many ways the exact opposite and to embrace in many ways the ambiguous nature of the term, the ambivalence around the concept, and to try and take seriously how people at different times thought about social justice in terms that might be very, very different from our understandings today. And so I think it would be very disingenuous for a historian to start with a very fixed kind of normative conceptions of what social justice actually is. Conversely, what one should do as a historian is rather to try and see how the term has been evolving over time, how its meanings have been changing, how they have been contested, how they have been defined in different ways amongst different groups. And I think that was kind of our ambition with this project, to be in a position to trace the evolving conceptions of social justice across the 20th century. And in doing that, we discovered that really historians had not very much thought about this as a subject in its own right. So there were a number of studies on, of course, the welfare state, on social policy and all of that. And many of these studies have in them some kind of tacit understanding of what social justice might actually be. But there was until our book, I think, very, very few attempts to actually think through the evolving projects of social justice across the 20th century and the different ways in which the term was understood. So to come back to your question, I think we really try to embrace a kind of open-ended approach to the subject, try to stay away from clear definitions. Of course, that also renders ourselves a little bit vulnerable, maybe, to criticism from other fields that demand to have a very clear understanding of what we actually mean by social justice. But at least in terms of this being a historical project, I think we wanted to understand how the concept has evolved over time.
Yeah, and as such, it's not intended to be the last word on the subject. We did think that we were engaged in an exploration here, and I think the verb map comes to mind, is we wanted to map the way in which social justice had been used across 20th century Europe. But as Camilo just indicated, there is, of course, a danger that we just fall into finding social justice everywhere and putting the label onto lots and lots of different things that have very little in common with each other. And I think that is, if you were to approach this in a definitional way, you would go through the book wondering whether some of the things we're talking about are actually social justice or are just things in a way pretending to be social justice.
You both have an established scholarly interest in the history of democracy, National Socialism, and the post-war reconstruction of Europe. How did your own academic trajectories lead you to the theme of social justice?
Well, I think we probably have to answer that separately, don't we? I mean, my own, I think, probably arose from what you mentioned about my interest in Belgium, which seems to me to be a society that in the 20th century discussed and debated and contested concepts of social justice quite energetically. I think my other reason for being interested in it is because I think, and probably here Camilo would agree with me, that we're a bit fed up of some of the meta-narratives of 20th century European history, which are often very teleological and somehow arrive at some terminus in 1989. And we were interested in using social justice as a subject in itself, but also as a means of trying to bring a bit greater diversity and complexity, shall we say, to the European history of the 20th century.
I think in my case, so I've worked quite a bit on the immediate post-war period in Germany. So when you do that, that naturally prompts questions about continuity and change across 1945. Those are old questions, right? But of course, in more recent years, we've been discussing quite intensively in this kind of particular area the question of, continuities across different regime types, right? So which are the things that lingered on after the end of the Third Reich, of course. So these are, questions that interested me, and I wondered about how conceptions of social justice played into this. But I think a more kind of overarching theme is the question of how political systems justify their existence and establish some form of relationship with the population. So I think that's a very important theme in my kind of work. And if you work on the immediate post-war period, I think what you will find is that you have a very kind of immediate way of interaction between rulers and ruled, very much organized around the provision of particular goods. Now think of housing, coal, but also in some ways forms of spiritual welfare and so on. The question of how social justice became a very powerful language that governments and political regimes use to legitimize their existence, plays out in very strong ways during moments, in the aftermath of conflict, in the wake of the Second World War. And I think anybody, regardless of where you look in Europe, will be confronted with similar types of situations in which discourses that are organized around notions of social justice have become very visible in many ways in the primary sources, in the ways in which people are mobilizing, in the ways in which political regimes and technocrats start interacting with the people. So I think that was one important thing that caught my attention. At the same time, to come back to the point that Martin made about these meta-narratives. So if you work on the kind of post-1945 period, we'll very often discover a kind of very strong line of interpretation in the literature, which goes basically like this. The idea is that there was some kind of social democratic project that brought about the welfare state, and that because of that, we had a period that one might call a golden age of, Western Europe, where essentially there was an expansion of the welfare state due to the workings of very committed social democrats leading up basically up until the 1990s, where it was then destroyed by the kind of the onset of neoliberalism and all of that. And I think Martin and I have in different ways become, as Martin said, quite fed up a little bit with that kind of discourse, because it didn't seem to me, at least, to capture very well the ways in which very different political forces, some of which we don't instinctively associate maybe with projects of social justice, have been crucial in implementing projects that we today would label as connected to social justice. In particular, of course, one might think of Christian democracy, right? But also all sorts of technocratic forms of government that played into this. And so this kind of philological progressive history of ever more social justice because of a kind of group of committed activists seemed to me always quite problematic, and something that I wanted to engage with.
You mentioned earlier, but the book brings together a wide range of case studies and disciplinary angles from markets and labor to gender, authoritarianism, and the European Union. So what challenges did you face in balancing thematic cohesion with regional and chronological diversity?
I think you've already heard that probably we didn't worry as much about coherence as we did about diversity. You know, I don't think that this is a book where we would want to emphasize coherence at the expense of just bringing out the complexity of the overlapping and indeed conflicting strands of discourse and of action that existed within social justice. So in that sense, it's a book that is not seeking coherence. It's certainly not seeking an essentialist definition of social justice, but we would hope that it works as a way of reorientating the attention of historians towards this important field, which I think, as Camilo's just said very well, is often caught up in the complex interactions between states and authorities and society. And so much of the writing about 20th century Europe over the last 10, 20 years seems to me to be exactly in that field. Not, for example, talking about how states dictated things to society, not talking about how societies overthrew states, but often talking about the rather more complex, messy interactions between the two, where the one does influence the other. And social justice is a great field for seeing that.
I mean, just to add, I think it would be almost impossible to really achieve some form of sort of histoire totale of social justice in the 20th century. I think you would, whatever you do, someone would say, and, where is, Finland in this story, or where is that country? I think we quite early on in the project made the decision that, we could not achieve that sort of comprehensiveness, but we wanted to, in some way, as Martin said, achieve a fair representation of different themes and the diversity really of topics, right?
Yeah.
To do really justice to different strands in thinking and doing social justice.
But are then any surprising interpretations or findings that emerge from contributors' chapters?
I think most people reading the chapters in the book would say that we probably give a surprising prominence to social justice projects of the right, because there is a sense that is in many of our heads that somehow social justice is in the end a cause owned by the left, or at least by a progressive family of political forces. And I think we were quite determined to break with that and to demonstrate the extent to which social justice was also a preoccupation of regimes of the right. Do I need to add that often the things they did were not right? Do I need to add that often the things they did were really much more bluster and propaganda than they were effective delivery? I hope not. I think that the book shows that a lot of the rhetoric, for example, of the Francoist state in Spain was tied up with social justice, but the actual delivery of social justice was pretty minimal. But I think it's important as historians to capture the way in which social justice emerged from different political families.
Right. So I think another surprising finding we had in the book, for example, relates to the question of migrants. And we have an excellent chapter in the book by Daniel Gordon, who talks a little bit about the lineage of thinking of migrants as opposed to social justice, as being a problem for social justice, which is, of course, a discourse which we are familiar with from the far right. But because look carefully, it's also something that already has a history within the political left, starting in the 1960s, where migrants are constructed as, in many ways, disrupting the class cohesion of factory workers, white European factory workers, and in many ways starting to being seen as a problem, as something that is going to take away social justice from the pre-existing population of a given area. And Daniel traces this, and it leads up in many ways to our current situation, where you have presumably left-wing parties of the types of, think of Sarah Wagenknecht and others, who establish political parties that see themselves as spokespersons for social justice, but at the same time reject migration. And I think that was a kind of counterintuitive story, surprising story that very few people would have thought about when they thought about social justice during the golden age of the welfare state.
Okay, your focus on 20th century Europe brings out the complexities of the continent marked by dramatic transformation, war, totalitarianism, welfare state, you mentioned already, and also by integration. So when considering the traditional East-West divide in Europe, do you see persistent differences in how social justice is conceptualized or pursued? And has the post-1989 transformation fostered this divergences or the legacies of the past still shape divergent notions of labor and gender justice?
So I think one surprising finding of our book was that actually the language of social justice was in some ways present, but also absent in state socialist countries during the post-war era, right? One would think that social justice in some way was everywhere in Eastern Europe, in Central Eastern Europe. But what you find is, of course, that those in power did not speak very much the language of social justice proper, because in some ways they thought that they had already realized social justice, right? So it was not something, an objective to be achieved somewhere in the future, but it was something that had already been realized and therefore did not have to be discussed in those terms. But at the same time, because there was this notion in state socialist regimes that social justice had been delivered, of course, it also became something that people could use to hold a regime accountable. So you had to keep delivering on that promise of social justice. And it becomes something that in the long term, became a crucial factor, legitimizing political rulers in Eastern Europe, where people were seeing in some ways the clash between the reality of shortages and decreasing living standards, especially from the kind of 70s onwards, and the message of those in power who pretended that basically state socialist countries were egalitarian and had achieved a form of justice that was superior to that elsewhere, right? So what's interesting in terms of Eastern Europe, I think, is this way in which, in some way, the language of social justice is always present as something that explains the interactions between the people and those in power. And it also creates pressures on those in power to deliver things. But at the same time, it's phrased very differently than in Western Europe, where social justice is a term, is part of the political vocabulary, and is a term of political action and of political contestation. And then if we go further into the more recent past, so after the collapse of state socialism, I think there's a very interesting story there about social justice. So one way of telling that story would be about the unmaking of social justice, right? So you can think of this as basically the arrival of all of these neoliberal advisors, shock doctrine, all of that, and the very brutal unmaking of the structures of welfare provision that existed in state socialist regimes. And of course, that's all very true. Yeah. But at the same time, for example, as Adrian Grammer shows in the chapter in our book, there's also long-term legacies of the ways in which social justice was conceived during the state socialist period. So in some of these privatization schemes of the 1990s, and the ways in which companies were privatized, you still find notions, or at least you find the need of those in power to justify what they were doing, although what they were doing was really not social justice, at least in our terms, but to justify that type of policy of privatization, deregulation, and so on, in a language that echoed conceptions of social justice from the 20th century, from the previous decades. And so you see that, for example, in the implementation of notions of public ownership of companies, right? That turns into vouchers where people are given a stake in formerly state-owned companies. They're given shares. These shares end up not meaning very much. They lose their value, right? But there is this notion that the people have to be given ownership in the companies that belong to the state. And I think those are interesting kind of counterintuitive stories again, as far as this kind of East-West divide goes.
Yeah, and they cut across any simple notion of a divide between West and East. The terms of the discourse are different in West and East between 45 and 89 because of the different nature of the regimes. But so much of that story is a story that with a few twists you could turn into a story about the West, particularly the delegitimizing of certain regimes in the West because they don't seem to be delivering social justice or not delivering the forms of social justice to which people aspire. Larger conclusion? social justice is often more in the eyes of the people than it is in the eyes of the rulers. It's something that rulers aspire to deliver in different ways with different ideological traditions and the like. But look at the people. The people are often judging their rulers by various criteria, but one of those central criteria is how far the rulers are delivering a regime of social justice. Often the expectations of the people are a little unrealistic, what's new? But, there is a broader sense that actually within the structures of legitimacy within 20th century European societies, there is a preoccupation with social justice and a belief that it is the responsibility of rulers, whatever clothes and ideological colours they're wearing, to deliver a certain package of social justice. Quite interesting to work out where that comes from and how far it goes back. And, should we, instead of thinking about bringing our story up to the present, we should be taking it back into the 19th century. I think, for pragmatic reasons, we made this a book that basically starts after the First World War, but I think there's a lot to be written about the prehistory of social justice and particularly the development of this kind of socially embedded expectation that rulers should be delivering it.
This book focuses on the 20th century, but your follow-up special issue in Journal of Modern European History looks to the present. There you argue that social justice has in some ways lost its earlier confidence. Could you expand on this idea?
Yes, well, I think that both Camilo and I are quite preoccupied by this idea that the 20th century did end, which seems to be a fairly obvious point to make, but one that often historians rather sort of avoid confronting because they want to see the first decades of the 21st century as somehow the working out of issues of the 20th century. On the contrary, in what we write in this special issue about social justice, we're keen to say that the way new discourses of social justice have developed in the early 21st century, they are rather different. They're often much more based around identity politics. They're often much more based around issues of race and ethnicity and migration. And they're often based around a certain sort of individualism, a sort of transactional approach to social justice. Where's the social justice for me or for my people? And I think those are interesting new phenomena. And so for us, I think Camilo would echo this. We think social justice is a good way of confronting the history of the present.
We're soon going to be commemorating the anniversary of the Second World War, right? That's kind of a good moment again to think a little bit about how the significance of the 20th century has in some ways come to an end in terms of the ways in which the major political, evolutions of that age configured the political space, certainly for the post-war era, an era defined in many ways by the mid-20th century. How those kind of ways in which we have become accustomed to make sense of history are no longer very useful for explaining our present day politics, and how those present day circumstances have a very different type of logic. And that leads to very interesting and confusing situations, right? Where you have, right-wing formations that are very able in many ways in using the language of social justice. And you can basically see this as just a kind of propaganda tactic, but you can also try to understand where that comes from and how it functions as a very effective way of talking to the people and articulating a conception of social justice that is very, very different from the ones that we've become accustomed to from the second half of the 20th century. And so for historians, the question then becomes to understand, where do these new concepts come from? But also, why are these new formations, political formations, so successful in deploying that language? And why are people receptive to this? Because I think this is always a two-way street, as Martin has always tried to make clear. What we are interested in is this interrelationship between the people and those in power. And if, there's many reasons why populist movements today are successful, but surely one of them seems to be that they are very good in using a particular language of social grievance that many groups can empathize with. And those groups are maybe different from the ones that were at the forefront of the kind of development of notions of social justice in the second half of the 20th century. But they are nonetheless extremely important. Think of pensioners, think of former industrial workers, and so on and so forth, right? So what I think we're saying in brief is that there's a new history of social justice that has in some way originated at the 1990s that as historians we need to take seriously and to treat on its own terms.
Thank you for sharing your insights, and good luck with your future projects.
Thank you very much
Thank you
indeed.
for doing this.